Yo, what's going on, E7 fam? I'm Sue, and it's that time yet again. World Arena season is ending. The spring 2025 season is drawing to a close on April 5th at, I believe, 3 a.m. UTC. But if you're like me and you're here in America, that's going to be Friday night, April 4th at around 10 or 11 p.m. EST or 7 or 8 p.m. PST, so mark your calendars. And this time around, the skin is going to be for Sylvan Sage Vivian. It is the lilac fragrance skin for Vivian. I already felt that Sylvan Sage Vivian was probably the hottest girl in all of Epic 7, and this skin is really, really good looking as well. I cannot wait to get my hands on it. And I know a number of you out there can't as well, because several of you have already DM'd me on Discord asking for help, and that is kind of what we're doing here in this video. In case you're new here, I've done these before in the past for Lionheart Senya and Pirate Captain Flan. This is going to be a cheat sheet video in order to help you get that skin for Vivian. If you don't know, in order to get the skin, you need to finish Masters rating or higher in World Arena and have played at least one game in the last 72 hours from the ending of the season. If you can do all that, then the skin is going to be yours. Again, last 72 hours, the season ends on Friday night, April 4th. Mark those calendars. Again, this video is designed to be a cheat sheet to help you quickly make powerful drafts in World Arena and make getting Masters as painless as possible. I say painless as possible, but it's still going to be quite painful because current power creep and the current state of the format does reward players that have high speed gear, do have lots of limited and collab heroes, as well as many Moonlight 5-star heroes. I will try whenever possible to point out alternatives. There are a couple people that are on this tier list that I don't necessarily think are particularly great in this meta, but they are alternatives for you out there in case you are missing specific characters. Keep in mind, this cheat sheet, it's for standard players, right? Usually those of you out there that don't have a lot of high speed gear. You will need speed gear to gear at least 1 or 2 fast units, but you won't need a ton of them, right? If you're somebody who's built for speed, I would recommend trying like a cleave or aggro playstyle, in which case I would recommend you elsewhere. We will talk a little bit about aggro because there are a number of characters such as like Eligos, for example, that are aggro leaning that you probably will need in order to succeed in this format, unless you want to use your one pre-ban on a character like Afternoon Soak Flan. Just putting that out there. So if you've never seen this format from the previous 2 videos, how it works is it's a plug and play tier list here on the left. You can see that there are categories for each of the 5 picks. You have a first pick, a second pick, third pick, ban protection. This is a very important one, by the way. The thing that you choose in your third slot cannot actually be banned in World Arena, so this is probably the most important one to pay attention to and get good at kind of selecting the right tool for the right job. And then you have the 4/5th pick, which is largely like counter picks, right? So how it works is you'll see here, first pick, counter, or opener. You scroll down here. Here are the openers, and then here is the tier that has all of the carries that are first pick worthy. You simply just take a character from one of these 2 tiers, slam it into your first pick, and then you go to your second pick, which would be like tank, support, or floodgate. So here are supports, floodgates, and tanks. Pick a character from here that you think is good versus what they're playing. Plug somebody from this slot, so on and so forth, right? So that's kind of how the tier list actually works. In case you want to, kind of follow along, have your own tier list in front of you, I will link an image to it down in the video's description for you to check out, so that way you don't have to like take a screenshot of this video while you're watching it. If you just want to have it handy in a second tab or like print a copy of it ready to follow along, you are more than welcome to do that. I am going to spend about 20 or 30 seconds talking about each character, how I feel about them, and I'll also show on screen a quick build on how to play them in case you just don't know how you're supposed to gear the character. There are also, if we scroll down here, a huge number of counter picks, right, for me to talk about. I don't want to spend 20 to 30 seconds talking about like this like 20 or so characters that are down here. I'm only going to talk about the best ones in the top tier description. For these other ones, feel free to DM me on Discord or ask in the comment section below on how you use them or like what the best spot is for them. Right? If you want specifics, feel free again to actually reach out to me. Anyways, let's jump into the actual tiers that I could explain what they are. So first pick, you're going to choose either a carry or an opener, right? So openers are just characters that are designed to kind of give you a leg up. They kind of set the stage for your entire team. They either like get rid of your opponent's setup, or they do something very debilitating to your opponent so that they can't actually enact their game plan. I think your fastest gear should be on these characters. In the case of a character like Hellion Lua or Peira, we'll talk about those in a second, you might not necessarily need it, but it's important to have, even as a slow player, show something that's reasonably fast in your first 2 picks, so that way your opponent can't, like, it keeps them on the back foot, right? You don't want to just be like, oh, I'm going to show 2 slow characters at the start, because then they are more likely to try to cleave you. And I find at lower ranks, when you only have 1 pre-ban or your gear isn't necessarily the best, that's something you want to avoid. It's kind of like a poker face, like a bluff. You want to show those openers, and then carries are just characters that can do enough damage or just have enough lockdown potential that they can win a game almost by themselves. Like, they're kind of like a 1v4 character for the most part. Second pick should be a tank, support, or floodgate. Tank is self-explanatory, just they're the thing that holds Arius, the thing that reduces damage from your team. Support is also reasonably obvious. They have some kind of supportive ability to help stabilize a game or help you come from behind or make it very difficult for your opponent to actually try to kill your entire team. Maybe they give attack buffs or things like that, or enable an entire other strategy, like in the case of Frida. And then the last one, Floodgates. I didn't really know what to call this one here. It's very similar to like stacks in card games. These are characters that kind of exert pressure on your opponent's draft. It makes it so it's very difficult for them to do certain things, right? Like if they don't respect it, they won't actually be able to do the thing that they're trying to do. For example, Harsetti basically completely nullifies speed. Belian completely nullifies their ability to use souls. Veronica completely nullifies their ability to use immortality characters, so on and so forth. Do keep in mind that there are certain characters such as Empyrean Ilynav that are also floodgates and carries. There are characters that can appear in multiple of these. As you can see, Belian here appears in carry as well as floodgate, right? So do keep that in mind. We'll talk about what each of those characters do when we get to them. Third pick, ban protection, should be an opener, tank, carrier, floodgate. I know that's kind of pretty much everything but a counter pick if you had the first overall pick in the draft. And that's kind of true because the characters that are in most of these tiers, they're just all the OP ones. You just want to stack your draft with as many ones as possible. But if you are a second pick, you might want to consider taking a counter pick to their actual draft in the third pick ban protection slot. And then finally, the 4th/5th pick ones, it should be either a counter pick from this list. Ideally, the ones on the top are the consistent ones, the ones that are going to give you the most amount of wins, I feel like. And then as you can see here, it also says in the 4th/5th pick slot, there's an aggro pivot option. This is for those of you who are more veteran players who do have a decent chunk of speed. Essentially, if you ever take Zeo on a third pick ban protection, or you take Frida in the second or third pick as a standard player, it enables what's called an aggro pivot. So instead of being the slow, tanky turn 2 player, you have the ability to flip the script on your opponent and be the aggressor in a matchup. And these are the characters that you take in your 5th pick slot if you've decided to take Zeo or Frida, right, in your second or third pick. It enables things like Araminta or like Successor Teiyu, for example. So now that you have a general gist of the draft flow, what each of the tiers means, let's talk about each of the characters now. And we're going to start with my girl, Hellion Lua. I think if you have Hellion Lua, she should almost always universally be your first pick in this run. I think there is not a single character right now that is better than Hellion Lua. She does basically everything you could want. She exerts pressure on your opponent's draft, whether they are fast or slow, because they don't know how fast you are. Very few openers can interact with her. Her S2 with the artifact Etika Scepter could carry a game outright. Her S3 is completely backbreaking, full strip, unbuffable, seal. You can wear Ancient Book and Soulburn this and completely just ruin their entire day with this character. Hellion Lua, if she is available and you have first pick and you own the character, should be your pick. Do keep in mind, you do not need this character to be blazing fast. The faster you can build her with decent bulk, the better. But you can absolutely still play this character at like 250 speed with a ton of HP. The only real requirements are going to be basically over 20k HP and immunity set. And after that, your choice of Etika Scepter if you have a really high rank one. Otherwise, take Ancient Book. Next up, we have Hellion Lua, who is currently the highest win rate character in World Arena. And I think that's largely due to the fact that she just doesn't have, in my experience, too many great counters to her, which is a surefire sign that you should probably pick her up and use her if you have access to her. The characters like Mort and Designer Lilibet that people say work against her, I found to be somewhat inconsistent. I've heard talks of things like Festive Eda on Guide to a Decision being very good against her, but I haven't really tested those out myself. But basically, it's a ranger, the tankiest ranger in the game at that. On Guiding Light, she can undo all of your setup, and she can hard control a game with all the various provokes in her kit. The fact that she is so devastating to players that are slower than her, and she has so few good answers, is why she is one of the top picks, I feel like, in the format. If you have access to her, you should definitely build her and use her. Next up, we come to Lone Wolf Peira. I got a lot of flack from players because I said this character was broken before her release, but here we are now, about a month or so after her release, and she is one of the strongest characters pretty much in the entire format. I think she's like 9th in terms of win rate right now, but she is absolutely one of the most played characters right now, and for good reason. She enables so much stuff. She could be an opener for cleave, she could be an opener for aggro, she could be a cleanser for you turn 2 players out there. She just does a lot of things. It's very ambiguous what is going to happen when you take Lone Wolf Peira. They don't know if you're going to speed up or slow down because she is a cleanser, she is a debuffer, and she enables some very powerful synergies, especially with Urban Shadow Choux and other dark units. If you're somebody that likes to play Urban Shadow Choux or Bloodblade Karin as your primary carries for this format, Lone Wolf Peira should be one of the best picks, one of the early first picks for you in a draft. The last of the big 4 openers to talk about alongside of Luna, Lua, and Peira is going to be Sea Phantom Politis. She is a permanently stealth, very fast opener that can strip buffs off the enemy team, guarantee dual attacks with your carry, and also slows down the enemy team. She just does a lot. She gives you an insane amount of advantage and tempo in the draft, and that's before we talk about the fact that her passive reduces things like fighting spirit and focus, making her pretty good against things like your Afternoon Soak Flans, your Urban Shadow Choux, your Abyssal Yufines, which you'll probably see on your way up to Masters. She is just a very powerful opener, and if you want to play this character, you have access to her, definitely put all of your high speed gear on her and use her as your opener, assuming that you're not going to use one of the 3 previous ones that we talked about. And then finally, to round out this section, is Conqueror Lilias. And honestly, Conqueror Lilias is not very good in this format, but a lot of people who have been watching my channel for a while have probably taken this character with things like your Moonlight's Blessing in the past. So if you're desperate for a high speed tempo opener, this is pretty much what's left. She's okay from time to time, but I don't think she's gonna be anywhere near as impactful as the first 4 that we talked about. This is largely just if you're like a returning player, you have Conqueror Lilias, you don't have the other 4, just put your fastest speed gear on her, or maybe put just some fast speed gear on her with things like Sweet Miracle or Warhorn, and hopefully try to win the game that way. Let's move on now to the carries, and they come in 2 flavors here. You have your first pick carries. These are the ones that are like super OP, or they're just really heavily contested regardless of playstyle. Your opponent is very likely to take one of these characters, so you might want to pick them up before they get stolen away. And then you have your carries that are 3rd pick onwards. These are ones that might not be as contested, or they're a little bit riskier to take, which is why they land in this tier. Anyways, the first character that's going to be in the first pick worthy carry tier is Afternoon Soak Flan, who is pretty much the DPS character of the format. She is a must pick, must ban, must answer character. If you're not going to be taking Flan and you're not going to be pre-banning her, you need to have an answer to her. That's most likely going to be a character like, say, Amiki or maybe Eligos, for example. So make sure you have some kind of answer to this character. This character enables so much. 100% dodge rate is just an absolute catastrophe of game design. She has got a guaranteed dual attack on any of your teammates as long as she still has focus available. Defense break, insane tempo to your team. Basically, just having Flan on your team turns your team into an aggro team, even if you're just trying to play, say, Diene and Krau alongside of her. She's just so powerful that she can just DPS and hard carry a game all by herself. She is definitely one of the highest priority first pick characters in this format. Next up, we have Death Dealer Ray, who used to be and still kind of is the boogeyman of the format. He is the control carry. He presses his S3, strips the opponent, sleeps them, venoms them, gives his entire team pestilence, and then just kind of locks down people, systematically dismantling them. If you like to play a slow, methodical playstyle or just don't have most of the damage dealers in the format, but you do have him. He's pretty much going to be your slow and steady carry for the entire format. Just know that he does have some very pronounced hard counters, namely Schneel. If you're going to be playing Death Dealer Ray, I highly recommend taking Tori alongside of Death Dealer Ray because she can usually outright kill characters like Celine or Schneel in one hit, which are commonly going to be picked against you. This is another character where if you don't have a good answer to him, you probably should invest in him, and we'll talk more about those in the top tier counter pick section. Next up, we come to Empyrean Ilynav, the best overall character from the last season. She's not as good now, but she's still absolutely a top 5 character in this game. She is one of the few characters that you could play on Aureus in the first 2 pick slots. So if you're looking for somebody that you can actually place in the first pick or second pick slot that can be your tank, Ilynav is that character. She is a jack of all trades knight that can be your carry, she can be your cleanser, she can be your tank. She basically does it all, gets a million turns, but her major selling point is that she restricts the usage of penetration from your opponent, which means characters like Jenua or like Eternal Wanderer Ludwig cleave, right? Even Blue Krau in standard v standard matchups gets a lot worse. She is arguably the best overall knight I feel like to pick up early in the draft. If you're just looking for a utility knight, you can't really go wrong with Empyrean Ilynav. Next up, let's talk about Abyssal Yufine, who is a character that's making a big resurgence in the last month or so as an early pick. She's still played in her traditional lifesteal, Elbrus Ritual Sword style manner, but because tempo and aggro drafts are just so powerful right now, by taking Abyssal on 1, you have this character that kind of just hard denies a lot of combat readiness pushing strategies, and if they want to double down on it, you can take a character like Red Politis later on in the draft. She's also just a fairly good carry against a lot of the DPS that are in this format, and then obviously Trauma still just takes over the game. If you want to get cheeky, you could also build her as a protection set knight on Aureus and have her use Trauma as kind of a carry in the late game. That is very, very powerful. It's not commonly seen, but it is a very good thing to do. And if you are looking to play an Aureus Knight early in the draft, just like Empyrean Ilynav, Protection Set Abyssal is actually one of the better options to do that. Next up, we come to Urban Shadow Choux, the bane of most turn 2 players' existence. If you like to take Lone Wolf Peira, Urban Shadow Choux is basically her best friend. They're like peanut butter and jelly. If you have Peira, Choux should be pretty much your like next best option, right? You should look to be taking these two together as often as possible. They just give Rat insane synergy. Make sure you have the exclusive equipment, by the way, for Urban Shadow Choux. She loses a lot of value if you don't have access to this thing. Just staying in stealth, giving your team speed buff, and generating injury and fixed damage over the course of a game is just very, very backbreaking and hard for any slower draft to actually deal with. Moving on, we have Bloodblade Karin, who is our first of the third pick onwards carries. This is a character that everyone has access to and is very difficult to deal with if you do not have a plan. She is one of the main reasons why I highly recommend, if you are kind of a slower tank down player, putting your tank under third pick ban protection every single game, because she does struggle against some mitigation if you can kind of tank up well enough. And obviously everyone has access to Veronica if you cleared episode 5 of Adventure, and Veronica is a major hard counter to this character. But overall, Bloodblade Karin just has an incredible matchup spread across the board. I feel like she works in a number of compositions. And again, if your opponent just doesn't have one of these like cherry-picked answers like a Veronica, and they're not particularly tanky, Bloodblade Karin can absolutely weather the storm and just run people over. Also, if you don't have a ton of effect resistance, feel free to just play her at like 220 speed on Destruction and Torrent with as much damage as possible. Next up, we come to Belian. Belian only works as a carry if you have 3F. So if you didn't play during the Overlord collab, then the only real way I think that you can play Belian in this format is as a protection set knight on Aureus. It's pretty much that, or you play her on 3F, and you can either do that as a very fast Belian on like speed immunity at like 230 or 240 speed plus on 3F, or on a counter set at like 180 speed with as much bulk as possible on 3F. No matter how you slice it, Belian is actually one of the best characters overall in this format. She stops a lot of the aggressive strategies. She's very, very tanky and provides reliable damage with 3F. She just overall can just weather a lot of nonsense and provides just incredible damage to your team with that artifact. On top of that, and it's not for nothing, her imprint being effect resistance means that she synergizes really well with other knights. Most knights have like an effect resistance imprint. So if you have imprints on your characters, you can set them all to ER. And she also generates passive resistance for your team. Just overall, one of the highest win rate, best characters you can play as a turn 2 player in this format. Next up is the newest limited in Tori, who is a incredible damage dealer that functions very similarly to like Tempest Surin or Spectre Tenebria did in the past. Essentially, if you provide protection for Tori, make it very difficult for your opponent to get to her, and her cockroach passive, give her a bunch of barriers and things like that, she will carry a game for you. I highly recommend that if you're going to be playing Tori, that you pair her with characters like Adventurer Roz, Diene, and especially Death Dealer Ray. And that last one is largely because when she gets her Cascade buff, she gets a free soul burn that does massive damage, making her one of the best characters in the entire game to one-shot Schneel and then take over the game with Death Dealer Ray. She's also very good at one-shotting Bystander Hwayoung if the opponent doesn't have really good gear on the character. So if you play Luna and you see that you're playing against Bystander Hwayoung a lot, consider taking Tori in your third pick ban protection slot. Moving on, we have Jenua. I think of the third pick carries and just the carries overall, he's probably the worst one here, largely because of how prevalent Empyrean Ilynav can be. But there's still something to be said about strong, defense penetrating single target attacks, making him excellent into characters like Bystander Hwayoung or Schneel or any other problematic floodgate that you're running into, any problematic counter that you're running into. If you see that your opponent doesn't have Empyrean Ilynav, doesn't really have a tank, he's a pretty good character to take in your third pick ban protection. He still does a ton of damage and still has good carry potential even in this format. Moving on to supports now, we have Blood Moon Haste, who is a staple of any turn 2 player. His S2 passive Grudge makes it so that if you kill somebody on his team before him, he gets a massive power up and a huge barrier, and then he can use his ultimate to kill a character basically in one hit after the power up and revive his entire team. He basically forces your opponent to have to kill him first, otherwise they cannot actually win the game. On top of that, he has some true damage, some strips, things like that in his kit that make him very, very valuable. His build has changed since last season. A lot of players are very aggressive and have a lot of high damage carries in the format. So as a result, most players have dropped all of their effect resistance from Blood Moon Haste and solely focus on as much bulk as possible. If you have incredible bulk, like 2,000 plus defense, like 25k plus HP, then you can absolutely still use Counter Celestine as the build. Otherwise, I highly recommend switching him to your Proof of Valor. As long as Haste stays on the board and they cannot kill him, you will win that game, so it's absolutely worth investing your Proof of Valor into him. Next up, we have Diene. Diene is very good if you want to play characters like Blue Krau or Adventurer Roz as a core to your draft. She also functions kind of like a mini version of Empyrean Ilynav, having penetration resistance now on her S3. She could also be your cleanser, so if you put a ton of effect resistance on her, she could kind of be good against debuffs, although not as reliable as some of the other characters that we'll talk about here on this list. Overall, Diene is a very good character for you to take in your second pick slot if you're not really sure what you want to do with your strategy, right? She covers a lot of bases. She allows you to tank down if you want it. She allows you to speed up with her CR pushes if you want it. She allows you to play against control with her cleanse if you want it. I think that, again, she's very good when paired with characters like Death Dealer Ray or Tori, for example. After Diene, we move on to Laia, who is the current limited that is available as I'm recording this video. Laia on Sweet Miracle is not the powerhouse she was a year ago, but she is absolutely somebody that you should have built on that artifact. She is one of the best cleansers still in the entire game, and one of the few characters that will save your bacon against certain nonsense in this game. She's very strong versus things like Naqual. She could save you versus New Moon Luna and Hellion Lua if you have access to it, right? Do not underestimate Laia. If your opponent also just doesn't have injury on things like Death Dealer Ray, Empyrean Ilynav, if they're not going to play Diene for the penetration resistance, then Laia can also double as a carry. Again, not broken like she was a year ago, but absolutely still a high tier to top tier character that you should have if you're trying to climb World Arena. Next up, we move on to Designer Lilibet, who's not as insane as she was back in like November of last year. She's still very strong against things like Harsetti, so if you're running into Harsetti, she's one of the better cleansers there. But if you look at the openers that we've already talked about, they all have ways to kind of play around or kind of deal with her. You have your New Moon Luna can just steal her. Sea Phantom Politis restricts her fighting spirit, which makes it harder for her to do her job. Peira enables so much aggro that they could just kill the design a little bit before it gets a turn. And even Hellion Lua, it's a decent option, but not super great. So that's kind of why you've seen a decline on design a little bit. Absolutely still a cleanser that you should have access to if you are going to be playing World Arena and you do have her, right? Especially for that Harsetti matchup. But again, not as strong as she was in previous formats. She's just kind of like hanging on there as kind of like the niche, sometimes like 1 in every 10 games cleanser or so. And then finally we move on to Frida. Frida is largely used for aggro pivots that we talked about at the start of the video. You take Frida if you have the ability to go Zeo on 3 and then kind of transition into a cleave or an aggro draft. If you're not going to be using her for that, the main reason to build Frida is because you want to take Belian on 3. By taking Frida on 2 and then Belian on 3, if your opponent is trying to cleave you, it massively restricts the options that they have, right? You're essentially using Frida as like a budget Diene, and then you're using Belian as either your tank or your carry and building your entire draft around that. By taking Frida away from the cleave player and locking Belian under 3, it punishes them very, very harshly. The next section is Floodgates. Remember, these are the things that put incredible pressure on your opponent's draft by restricting certain things that they can and cannot do, maybe potentially things that they might not be able to draft. And we're going to start with obviously the most controversial character in Epic 7 history, and that is, of course, Harsetti. Harsetti basically restricts the speed stat entirely, slowing the game down to a crawl in a format that is very heavily favoring very fast, very aggressive characters. Harsetti is currently the most pre-banned character in the game at 85% at all ranks. So there's a pretty good chance that you shouldn't base your whole strategy around her because she's probably going to be banned nearly every single game. But if she is available, she is still very, very strong. I'm not going to get into like the details of how to build a whole account around her, all the various different builds you can do with her. Just be aware that she's very strong, very heavily banned, and there are counters to her. Things like your opponent picking Zeo and has dedicated anti-Harsetti cleaves under third pick ban protection. And then also young Senya, who we'll talk about later. If you are going to play Harsetti, do make sure you pick up young Senya in your 2 slot. And also, it works a lot better if you are the second pick overall in the draft and therefore have access to your third pick ban protection second, because it basically eliminates the need to have to worry about these various different Zeo drafts. Let's skip over Belian because we've already talked about her and move on to Veronica. Veronica is freely available for anyone who's made it to chapter 4 of episode 5 in the story. Completely free. Everyone should have access to her. She has a speed input for your team, which does help you if you're trying to outspeed a specific character with your opener. Also just generally useful to have. Character is a must-have for fighting characters like Jenua, like Amiki, and especially Bloodblade Karin. With her exclusive equipment, she has a lot of flexibility, right? You have the CR push back on the S3, and you also have the CR push up on the S2, which means that certain characters like Abyssal Yufine or Red Politis, which aggro cleavers used to use to counter the character, don't really necessarily work as well anymore. Again, Veronica is a character that everyone should have access to, no exception. After that, we move on to Bystander Hwayoung, or as I like to refer to her, Super Karina, because that's basically what she is. She's like the new age version of Karina. The only problem is that it's random on who dies, and she's also insanely difficult to build. This is arguably the hardest character to build in all of Epic 7, right? Aside from just characters that just need raw speed. It's basically Bystander, Hwayoung, and Arya are the 2 most difficult characters to build. So if you don't have the gear to build a really good one, maybe this character is actually a skip. The main thing about her is she's super good against light-based characters. She's very strong versus Belian, Empyrean, Ilynav, and she basically boxes out characters like Last Rider Krau and Ambitious Talent, just makes them completely worthless. She's also very, very strong against New Moon Luna, assuming that Luna doesn't just run over your entire team first, right? If you get into a 1v4 scenario, it's very possible for you to lose with Hwayoung unless you get very lucky. But if you're looking for a character that can carry and can kill Luna in one hit, and you have other characters like maybe an Infinite Horizon of Hades that we'll talk about later to check the New Moon Luna, then it's absolutely worth having a Bystander Hwayoung on your team. Again, though, very difficult character to build. Next up is Eligos, and admittedly, Eligos isn't really so much a floodgate as he is just a insanely good counter pick, one that I don't think that you could really go without, especially if you don't have Solitary of the Snow. Eligos' primary reason for being played in this format is he absolutely murders Afternoon Soak Flan. He hoses that character. If you are going to be letting Flan through, I highly recommend putting your fastest damage gear on Eligos. You will not regret it. I've been playing him now for a couple weeks like this, and it's just been phenomenal. I don't have to worry about Flan at all, right? You just put the exclusive equipment on him that gives him stealth. If they have no way to break stealth, even if they like Zeo and outspeed you, it's very possible for Eligos to get a turn, kill Flan in one hit, and then set himself up for success with his briefcase if you get any other kills. Just amazingly good character in this format. He truly deserves that name, Eligod. And again, he probably should be in top tier counter picks, but he puts the fear of God into any resource based character, and he's just so strong, I feel like, in this format that everyone should have access to him. After that, we move on to young Senya, and admittedly, I'm not too keen on this character. I don't particularly like playing this character, but there are, you know, legend players out there like Light who do play young Senya every once in a while, right? She is very pivotal for you to have, because by having her, you make it so that your opponent cannot really take Harsetti, right, without getting punished, right? So that's kind of her role, why she lands here on the Floodgate section. If your opponent's going to take an early Harsetti, right, if they have first pick overall and put Harsetti down first, you can put young Senya under third pick ban protection, and it just completely locks them out. Or you can put it on 2 and just bait them. If they try to take the Harsetti, you already have a leg up in the draft. You already have one character that checks it, and then you can dedicate 3 other counter picks to the Harsetti and kind of deal with her that way. She just overall is also a very good support that you can use to kind of check AoE drafts, right? If they're going to play a draft that has a ton of AoEs, like say like a Briar Witch Assaria, you could take young Senya on 3 and then like 2 green characters in your draft, and if they press the button, well, then they just get run over by small Senya. That's pretty much her value, why she's here in the Floodgate section. And then the last character in this section is Dragon Bride Senya, who used to be like on the cusp of top tier a couple months ago, and now I feel like she's kind of mid tier, and that's largely due to just look at the openers and the carries that are in the format, right? You have Luna to seal her, you have Hellion Lua to control. Peira sets up a lot of these damage dealers that just completely maul her. Flan just rolls her over. Ilynav rolls her over. Choux rolls her. Death Dealer Ray rolls her. Just so many things beat this character. But there is a time and a place where the character is worth it, right? If you're somebody who is going to be banning Luna, right? Or you're going to be taking Luna every draft and you're going to be playing like, say, BBK or whatever have you, you can kind of pick her and say like, hey, whatever my carry that's going to be in my third pick ban protection, my Tori, my BBK, if you're not going to play a seal into me, I'm just going to completely roll you, because if you can't contest BBK, then this character is just going to run you over, right? That's kind of how you have to think of Dragon Bride Senya in the current format. She's just there to stall for time for whatever character you put under third pick ban protection to just take over the game and become an unstoppable force. After Floodgates, we come to the backbone of turn 2 gameplay, and that is, of course, going to be your tank. Tanks are a lot harder to use in this format than they were in the past, right? Before, you would take your Krau or your Ambitious Tywin in the first 2 picks and you would be fine. I feel like nowadays, unless you show like Empyrean Ilynav or Abyssal Yufine, which could be a DPS but still built as a tank, right? You will get run over if you show that you're slow very, very early on. Maybe Krau on 2 or Raz on 2, but they're usually supported by a very fast Diene, right? You have to show a fast character before you show a tank. You just can't take a tank early on. I feel like you will just get eviscerated. And for most people, if you're just not comfortable with the draft, I highly recommend putting your tank under your third pick ban protection. It's what will allow you to win, I feel like, the most amount of games. Tanks are very strong. They're just hard to use. Another thing that I will say, most of the tanks in this format are protection set tanks, right? Of the ones that I have here, the 6 that are here, 4 of them are protection set tanks, with the other 2 having an option to do so. So if you do not have protection set, you're gonna probably be locked into just playing like Krau and Raz, because the others I feel like really need protection set in order to actually be good. On top of that, immunity is going to be a must because things like Peira and other openers could very easily defense break but can't strip, and you will die, right? You will absolutely get murdered. So protection set immunity is very, very key, I feel like, to having a strong tank in this format. You don't need that many of them, but I do recommend having at least one immunity protection set tank with like your best tank gear. That would be very much ideal. Now, there is one tank before I jump into this that I did not leave here on the list, and that is Yulha. Yulha can be very good and is built very similar to how Krau is, so I didn't feel a reason for me to actually have it here twice. But she's only really played alongside of Young Senya. If you don't play Young Senya for just like regular usage, I probably would not invest in Yulha. There's another green tank that we'll talk about in a little bit that I think is, in my personal opinion, quite a bit better, especially if you are a newer player that doesn't have too many great options against aggro and cleave. So let's start this section off by talking about Albedo. If you don't have her because she's a collab limited, I'm sorry, but Albedo is the best tank in the game. If all you are looking for is to have a tank that just reduces the damage your team takes, nobody does it better than Albedo. She's pretty flexible, but for the most part, all you really need is just like 1500 defense, like 30k HP if you can get it. If you can't get that much, just get as much as you can, and then just put her on protection set immunity. After that, some effectiveness is luxury, ER is luxury, but for the most part, just as tanky as you possibly can get it. Don't worry about the speed. Just slap her on RAS protection set immunity, and you are pretty much good to go. After that, we move on to Krau. Krau is probably the second best generically good mitigation knight in the current format, right? The fact that he has basically built-in escort as long as his S3 doesn't get reset from certain characters, right? So like if you play against like Blue Lua or whatever have you, that could be a bit rough. That kind of counters him. But otherwise, he is free to kind of use whatever you want on your artifact. I personally play Adamant Shield on the character, but Holy Sacrifice is also very, very good. It basically guarantees that you get his Siegfried, his horse, which can absolutely just turn the tides of a game. He's probably the best tank for you to take if you're having trouble with Afternoon Soak Flan, because, hey, eventually he'll get low enough he could just one-shot that character. So that is definitely worth something. He synergizes really, really well with certain supports, right? Namely Diene, right? Is just very, very strong overall. Again, not as good as Albedo in my opinion, but he is kind of like, hey, I need a mitigation knight, but I also might need like a counter to a specific damage dealer, like a Bystander, Hwayoung, or an Afternoon Soak Flan, and that's what he's there for. You get that horse, come in, get that value, and hopefully turn the tide for your team and win the game. Next up, we come to Adventurer Raz, who is a tank everyone should have built. I think of the tanks that are available, he is the most aggressive. He's the one that you choose if you're looking to make big plays, and that's because of his S2 Command Strike. If you've ever played any Abyss, you already know how good Soulburning Command Strike is, and that's no exception here, right? You can use it to turn your really slow Bystander Hwayoung into like a machine gun. You could use it with BBK. You could use it with Tori, right? And he has incredible synergy, I should add, with Tori, right? If you have Tori in the back slot and his passive to protect, it becomes very difficult to deal with that character. Just overall, if you are looking for a character that can either hold your Bastion or Pelucia or your Arius and also still make, you know, big plays, then I think Raz is going to end up being your guy. Very good tank in this format. Next up, we come to perhaps my most controversial pick of the entire tier list, and that is Green Armin. I think Green Armin is the most slept on tank in the entire game. Holds protection set and immunity like an absolute champ. Skill 3 is a 2 debuff cleanse with the right EE, and on top of that, reduces single target damage from all sources on your team by 30%, and has built-in counter and AoE stun. She basically has an AoE Abyssal Crown built into the kit if you get lucky. Just, if you're playing against a hyper-aggressive single-target team, like they're just single-target aggro, no tank, or just single-target cleave, there is nobody that does it better than Armin. She's so hard to kill. She can absolutely just RNG out wins, and she's just generically good even in the face of certain debuffers, because if she just makes it to her turn, you could just press S3 and just cleanse everything out, right? I built her basically the way I would a normal tank, you know, about like 130 effect resistance, and then just jam a ton of defense and health. After that, slam her on Arius, again, protection set immunity, and you are good to go. considering how good I think this character is and the fact that she's 4-star, if you do not have Albedo, right, you just didn't pull Krau, or you fed him to your last rider Krau like a moron, pick up a green Armin. She will be your safety net. She can be your lifesaver. So now to round out this section, I want to talk about the last two tanks, which are Navy Captain Landy and Crimson Armin. Let's talk about Crimson Armin first. Crimson Armin is, in my opinion, a lot worse than the previous 4 tanks that we talked about, but her win rate is still pretty high on ladder. So if you have your old protection set Crimson Armin, you can use her in your 3rd pick ban protection slot, just like you have in previous seasons. She just doesn't really provide any tempo or anything I think that's like really super impactful or valuable. Like Green Armin, for example, can just random out games with stuns, and also has a 2 debuff cleanse, which is something Crimson Armin doesn't actually have access to. So I personally don't really care for Crimson Armin, but if you've used her in the past, she's still all reliable. She can still work as your tank. Now the last one I want to talk about here, Navy Captain Landy. This is a pretty interesting one, right? So Navy Captain Landy, why she appears here under tanks is because of the concept of buff stacking. If you put Navy Captain Landy on protection set with immunity, as well as Aureus as your artifact here, it creates a pretty interesting scenario. So you'll have your whole team spawn in with a barrier as well as critical hit resistance from Landy. Now, if you have another character that has immunity, or like stealth, or stealth and immunity together, a lot of the best strippers in the format only get rid of 2 debuffs. So if you have immunity, barrier, and critical hit resistance on a character, the game will try to strip the first 2 before the immunity, and therefore your character will just get off scot-free. So by stacking a bunch of immunity on your characters and taking a protection set Navy Captain Landy into battle, you make it so that certain debuffers, certain openers, can't actually interact with you or debilitate you on the first rotation like they thought they would. And that has some merit. That's kind of like a tech pick, and if you want to use that to climb to get masters, you are more than welcome to do so. And finally, to wrap up the video, let's talk about counter picks. I'm only going to talk about the top tier counter picks, as well as these 2 at the end, which I don't think are really top tier counter picks, but they are worth a special mention. We'll get to them when we get to them. But yeah, for the most part, everything from Celine all the way to Amiki, I think these are things that every player should have access to if you are playing in the format and you do own the character. If you want to know how to build the solid counter picks, unreliable counter picks, or just the aggro pivot stuff in general, then feel free to leave a comment down below or hit me up on Discord. But yeah, let's jump into the top tier counter picks. I'm only going to spend like 15 or 20 seconds on each of them. Basically explain when you pick them, why you pick them, and then go next. We're going to start with my girl Celine. It's pretty simple. Your opponent has a character like Sea Phantom, Politis, or Death Dealer Ray, somebody with a very debilitating non-attack skill. Celine checks them hard. If they press the button, they probably lose a character. They might even lose 2 characters. The exclusive equipment for this character is a little bit player's choice, dealer's choice right now. I personally still use the stun EE for the random factor, but that can proc Bystander Hwayoung. So if you're playing into a lot of Bystander Hwayoungs, you might want to consider highest attack EE, because that's usually going to end up being their Hwayoung. That'll allow Celine to kill Hwayoung, and you'll get past that roadblock. Very useful if you're going to be playing New Moon Luna, for example. And then just the S3 one is just good if you want to burst down specific characters, again, like Bystander Hwayoung. Moving on, we have Schneel. You pick him into Death Dealer Ray, and that's pretty much it. Right, you put him under your ban protection in response to an early Death Dealer Ray pick. Maybe you have 1 tank, and then you just hopefully have like enough carries to actually beat them, right? Schneel is really, really bad if you went like tank support as your first 2, because then you just won't have enough damage to actually overtake them. You need to make sure that at the end of the draft, with Schneel, you have at least 2 carries that could kind of rush down your opponent, because if they try to kill Schneel with something like, say, Tori or Jenua off rip, then you will lose that game to Death Dealer Ray. It becomes a basically a race at that point. He has a very high win rate, and he is very effective, but you just have to be aware that the only way Schneel works is if you are ahead of the Death Dealer Ray player. Because once you have Schneel and they have DDR, it's like you basically are playing a 3v3, because those 2 characters, they do not exist. They do not matter. If they have a way to pick off Schneel, you're in trouble. If you don't have more damage than your opponent, you are also in trouble. Next up is Infinite Horizon Acades. She is primarily used as an answer to Cleave, as well as an answer to New Moon Luna. If you have access to 2 copies of her, there are 2 ways to build her. I will put both up on the screen. The slower one is better against New Moon Luna, specifically if they're just trying to play like, not necessarily aggro, but like standard with New Moon Luna, right? and that is because you're so tanky, they can't actually kill you, and you'll just out-tempo them, just take more turns than them throughout the game. She's just too tanky for them to kill, and they get no value out of their Luna. The second one is built very fast, and basically kind of just cuts in front of the cleaver and gives you turn 2 after whatever their opener is, and allows you to S3 and undo all of their debuffs, or use your S2, push a key character to the front and kill their carry. So you have the one again for New Moon Luna, the other is anti-cleave. Choose whichever one you want, or ideally you build both. Moving on, we have Mort. Mort just completely boxes out counter-based strategies. If your opponent picks Abyssal Yufine early and you think it's a damage-based one and not a tank-based one, Mort on Band Pit Protection slot 3 is pretty good. But otherwise, you mostly pick him in response to things like Inheritor Amiki, which we'll talk about, right? Or if you're just trying to play young Senya, those are pretty much the reasons you use him. Just lock out counter picks, or just try to cheese somebody with his Sphere on his S3. After that, we have Archdemon Shadow. You're mostly just picking her as like a backup seal, right? If there's something that needs to be sealed and you already have New Moon Luna, and they have kind of like signaled in that they're probably going to ban it because their draft isn't good into it, that's a good time to take Archdemon Shadow. The other time that it's really good to take her is if you have Lone Wolf Peira, because she's dark. You'll get a lot of tempo out of her. I used to play this character on counter set, but I think right now, speed with Book to guarantee the seal and the guaranteed dual attack off of her exclusive equipment is the way to go. You're essentially just trying to seal problematic characters and just kind of generate tempo for your team, and hopefully that will push you over the finish line. After Archdemon, we have Solitaria of the Snow, and her primary use is to restrict focus-based characters, so she's very good versus Afternoon Soak Flan, assuming that your opponent can't kill it in one hit, and also very good against Urban Shadow Choux. You basically need to make sure that your Solitaria can survive, that they're not so aggressive that they can kill her on her first turn when she's vulnerable, but if you could somehow weather that first turn rotation, right, then you'll probably win the game with Solitaria. Just make sure that you take her in the later part of the draft from like 3 onwards. I've seen people take her in slot 2, which is wild to me because she just has too many hard counters for you to take her that early in the draft. Still, absolutely worth having if you are struggling against Flan, if you're struggling against Urban Shadow Choux. Next up, we have Inheritor Amiki, free-to-play character, something that everyone should have access to. All you have to do is just beat episode 5 of the story, do her specialty change, you have her. She's just a rock-solid anchor versus a lot of aggressive drafts, right? A lot of cleaves cannot actually deal with Inheritor Amiki. As long as they don't have Mort, right, and they're not just like 3 tanks, right? Amiki can absolutely stabilize and win you the game. You just wait till she goes to 1 HP, use her Soulburn S3, and then just pick off characters from there with her S1 until either you counter them to death and you win the game, or she eventually runs out of immortalities and you lose the game. Now let's talk about these last two, because these I think are the most interesting ones that are here. First up is Martial Artist Ken. So Martial Artist Ken is somebody you draft alongside of Afternoon Soak Flan. So you take Afternoon Soak Flan early, they take Eligos to try to counter your Martial Artist Ken, and then you have Martial Artist Ken to counter Eligos. Now, if you recall, after Ken's rework, whenever somebody on the enemy team crits somebody that's not Ken, he responds with his S1, which provokes them, and then they hit Ken on their next turn, and then they die. Problem with this is that Martial Artist Ken only has a guaranteed crit on his S2, not his S1 unless you Soulburn. So the strategy is build Martial Artist Ken with 100% crit and all damage. Therefore, if Eligos presses any button into anyone other than Martial Artist Ken, he instantly dies off of the supposed unable to crit S1 because you're built at 100%. So that's kind of the reason why you play him, right? If you see Eligos is going to be picked as a response to your Flan, you have a Martial Artist Ken, and if they are none the wiser, the second they press any button on Eligos, he just instantly dies. And that's pretty much the reason why Martial Artist Ken is here. The last one to talk about here in the video is going to be Festive Eda, and admittedly, I haven't actually played this one yet, but I've had a number of people tell me that they use it, and so I thought it was neat enough to actually include here in the video. So, in case you don't know, whenever Festive Eda breaks stealth, because she starts the game in stealth, on her first turn, she will use a big AoE attack that CR pushes back the entire enemy team, and defense breaks them, and potentially with her Esther, you could also tag them with a silence. So that's like a lot of debuff value that can absolutely turn a game in your favor. So what you do is you build a really fast Festive Eda on immunity, and you put her on the Artifact Guide to a Decision. So just like we talked about with Navy Captain Landy, Guide to a Decision gives you the barrier, you're on immunity set, and you start in stealth. So therefore, you have 3 buffs. They use their opener, right, that only strips 2 buffs, and then you are now knocked out of stealth, not pushed back, and have a very fast Festive Eda that can then take the turn and then just immediately S3 and just reap a ton of value and just win the game outright for you. It's very good, I've been told, against Stefan and Politis or things like Briar with Chessaria. People are trying to use like a big AoE strip. That is something that it can absolutely do for you. So again, I personally haven't tried this. Your mileage may vary, but it was really cool from what it sounded like, and I figured I would include it here in the video as something to try because I know people are really desperate for answers to things like Stefan and Politis. A lot of new players, a lot of slower players struggle against it. So if you have at least some decent speed gear, right, and you can muster up like 270 plus, don't really worry about the rest of the stats, you might actually get there. You might be able to actually steal a game off of Festive Eda. And that's going to do it for my World Arena Spring 2025 cheat sheet for standard players. Hopefully this helps you get your amazing Sylvan Sage Vivian skin. If you still have any questions or you need help, as always, let me know down in the comments below. Or again, please hit me up on Discord. Start early if you haven't already. The earlier you ask for advice, the better it can be. I have people every season that ask me for my help, but they always ask me like maybe 5 hours before the end of the season. At that point, it's a bit too late. I can't really help you. So if you really need help, please reach out to me or members of my community. Last season, we got about, I want to say 24 or so people their Pirate Captain Flan skin. So if you're still struggling, if this didn't help you, again, please reach out. I'm always willing to help you. As always, enjoy the rest of your day, the rest of your week, and I'll see you in the next one. Later now.